This is the first time that Scotland's case has ever been presented to the international community. The first time that we've ever had a chance to tell the truth about who we are and what this state known as the United Kingdom of Great Britain really is. So it's quite an experience to be here and a privilege to be with you all. Today, the world stands on a precipice, and the hope and the promise of the United Nations hangs in the balance. Never has it been so important to articulate and apply international laws and principles that uphold justice and the fundamental rights both of individuals and nations, because these are all that can light the way out of the darkness that is descending on our world. If, in the past, the international community has sometimes weighed the demands of justice and human rights against political pragmatism and opted for pragmatism, well, now we're paying the price, as international law is threatened with irrelevance, even as I speak. So, as I plead for my own nation of Scotland, I also plead for action, guided by an unwavering commitment to uphold what is just and lawful and clear, whatever the political cost, because failing to do so today sows the seeds of disaster tomorrow, if indeed there is a tomorrow for this violence-torn world of ours. What is just and lawful and clear in the case of Scotland? That's not a difficult question to answer. Not only does Scotland meet all the definitions of a non-self-governing territory, but uniquely, it also satisfies the definition of a dependency provided by its own coloniser, or administering power, to use the polite term. The British establishment has inscribed into the official record the privative definition, as you have heard, that Scotland is a nation and entered the union with England as a voluntary partner and not as a dependency. But this must also be read: if Scotland is not a voluntary partner in the union with England, then it is a dependency. The Scottish Liberation Movement, established 3 years ago, as notified this year to the Secretary-General and the Chair and members of the C24 of the United Nations, can show that this partnership does not exist. And so, as you have heard from my colleagues, both by de facto evidence and de jure, by the definition of the UK government itself, Scotland is a dependency, a non-self-governing territory, and the right of Scots to self-determination exists clearly, lawfully, and justly as the right to decolonisation. So, to recap why, a kingdom, remember the United Kingdom, a kingdom is the territorial jurisdiction of a crown. That is all it is. Without a single and united crown, there is no unitary, united Kingdom of Great Britain. No single and united crown of Great Britain was ever created. Although that was the whole purpose and intent of the treaty, the partnership agreement. Instead, England's crown incorporated Scotland into its own and continued uninterrupted. But because there is no unitary Kingdom of Great Britain, Scotland is not a territory within a unitary state, but a nation subjected to a foreign sovereignty. And because no new and unitary state was ever established, Scotland did not enter any union at all. There is no partnership in the state which is just England continuing. So, when you hear the word British, please do not be deceived. It simply means England, nothing more nor less. It always has. And England has continued unaltered except for a new name, and from 1707 absolute control of Scotland. With that control, it proceeded to abolish a fully developed and historic state. And then, as with every other colony, it erased our history. Languages, trade, communities, social structures, constitutional provisions and rights, and eventually the history of its own acts of genocide and ethnic cleansing of Scots from the record. On a personal note, I only began to learn the history of my own nation when I joined this campaign, and I am in my 60s. Every feature that distinguishes a nation and a people colonized, subjugated, utilized for military and imperial ambition and plundered of its assets and resources has applied or applies still to Scotland, just as they once applied to Ireland, India, and so many other nations. To administer and exploit a historically, culturally, and geographically distinct, a unique nation and people as a dependency is an ongoing act of colonization. This is the scourge from which Ireland broke free after some 700 years, India after 200, and African countries like Zambia, Kenya, Tanzania, Ghana, and Nigeria after decades and decades. The same scourge, which after almost 80 years of global decolonization now performs its worst cruelties on the world stage with apparent impunity. The Scots in general may have little understanding of what constitutes a colony, but there's no doubt what Scotland is. It is past time, surely, to consign that scourge to the dark annals of history for all of our sakes. But, says the British state, the treaty was signed and ratified, and the treaty defines Scotland as a voluntary partner in the Union and also establishes the United Kingdom as a unitary state. Well, we are to accept that the words of a treaty, and only the words, define the reality of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Scotland's place within it. We are to disregard the overwhelming weight of evidence for a substantive reality that bears no relation to the words, nor to any treaty or partnership agreement. A reality that proves those words null and inoperative. We must also ignore the evidence of 850 years of English history, starting with the Treaty of Windsor in 1175, broken 2 years later when the English Prince John was declared Prince of Ireland, and so heralding the centuries of Ireland's colonisation. Right up to the UK's violation of the EU withdrawal agreement in 2020. 850 years where England, or England as Britain, has used treaties or agreements in precisely the same way. And I am perfectly certain that sitting here today are people who can say, yes, that happened to us too. As many as 200 such treaties and agreements followed this pattern. Used first as temporary instruments of legitimacy, then set aside, reinterpreted, and violated once access or influence was secured, and finally, though breached and arguably void, retained as the basis of a rhetorical authority. This applies to Scotland and its treaty as it has applied to so many others that were never more than a means to an end, signed and then discarded in favour of colonisation. In the case of the Treaty of Union, however, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland can itself only exist as it has defined itself as the result of the merging of two sovereign and independent states if it is shaped by its own founding document. We've seen and heard how the continuation of England and the extinction of the state of Scotland replaced an international agreement for a new state with one united crown, kingdom and parliament. We have not heard what a united kingdom shaped by the treaty, the partnership agreement, ought to look like. It should be shaped, among other things, by the treaty's preconditions, the constitutional basis of the state to be created. Among these, the continued force for Scotland of a statute that underpins Scots common law and provides a codified expression of the most fundamental principles of the Scottish Constitution is the Claim of Right Act of 1689. This act remains a UK statute, supplying the appearance of proof that the Union underpinnings are indeed in place. But this is appearance only. The Act is reduced to the same status as those Scottish MPs in England's Parliament, which, as the author and English spy Daniel Defoe observed, were allowed to sit there for form's sake to be laughed at. The Claim of Right Act, too, remains for form's sake. What rights should pertain under the Claim of Right if the Union were really in place, shaped by the treaty that created it? It's impossible to illustrate all of them here, but two fundamental and astonishingly progressive provisions of the Claim of Right should serve. Let's begin with one which challenges the recent use of terrorism law by the UK government to prescribe a non-violent, direct action group, Palestine Action, when this prescription contravenes international norms, as Volker Turk had reminded Prime Minister Starmer only a few weeks ago, though to no avail. And today, anyone in the UK who directly or indirectly expresses support for the prescribed group is liable to arrest, as over 1,000 people can tell you. At the same time, the United Kingdom government has provided moral and practical support to the State of Israel, so it is clear that its reinterpretation of terrorism law in direct contravention of that law's stated purpose and of the guarantees that it would never be applied in this way is purely political. But this is not only internationally wrongful. Under the Claim of Right, such abuse is specifically prohibited in Scotland. I told you it was progressive. Clause 6 of a list of prohibitions within the Claim of Right Act states that the law may not be perverted into an instrument of political persecution. No government, magistrate, court may pursue, convict, or remove the liberty or property of any person by stretching or interpreting the law beyond its true intent and purpose in order to criminalise political opposition or dissent. Was this clause part of the condition of the Union respected by the United Kingdom government? It was not even raised as an obstacle to the bending of terrorism law for political ends. But if it's a fundamental law and still in force, it is on the statute books, then surely Scots can apply it to challenge the criminalisation of dissent. To raise it at all is to oppose the colonial doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty, the absolute authority assumed by England's Parliament under pre-Union English law to make or unmake any law it chooses. In Scotland, government is limited by the rights of the people. In England, the Parliament has the authority to make or unmake any law it chooses. Where stand then the rights of the people or the human rights that are recognised in international law? But to challenge this is something few in the legal establishment of Scotland or England are ready to attempt. And to successfully assert the simple and unquestionable fact of this guarantor of civil liberty is a near impossibility. Doesn't mean we're not going to try. Because we are not in a partnership. The terms of the partnership agreement were long ago discarded by England, and no one, either within or beyond its domestic circle, has so far found a way to challenge this breach. Moving from civil rights to assets and resources, we find territorial dispossession, the administration of Scotland's oil and gas, the disposal of territorial assets, and the redirection of its renewable energy to supply the English domestic market, among many other examples, demonstrating the reality of Scotland's status. How does this show in law? Well, because no united crown was ever created, no British crown exists, the Crown of Scotland remains as a legal and constitutional reality. Now, it's important to know something about the Crown of Scotland. In most monarchies, the Crown is the monarch. In Scotland, it is not. In Scotland, the Crown, the sovereign authority, is the community of the realm or the people. How radical is that? How progressive is that? And yet it's an ancient provision. The claim of right protects the Scottish Crown by making it a requirement that the Scottish coronation oath remains in force, that it must be taken. And this oath also remains on the statutes because it is protected by the Claim of Right Act. Within that oath is a promise that any monarch must take to be lawful monarch of Scots, to defend and never transfer the rights of the Scottish Crown. And so, because our Crown remains, Scotland retains its territorial sovereignty. It is recognised as a stateless but sovereign territorial nation. The territory of Scotland remains legally vested in the Scottish Crown, which is the people. And so, legal title to the territorial and maritime assets of Scotland resides with the Scottish people, not a monarch, not a government, and not a parliament. The continuing English state may talk of the British Crown and the right of the Crown as if there was only one. But two exist in fact. One has title to Scotland, the Scottish Crown. The other administers Scottish assets, oil, gas, territorial waters, etc., without title. And this constitutes alienation of territory and resources without consent of the sovereign people. The International Court of Justice recognises certain obligations owed to the entire international community, erga omnes obligations. These include the right of peoples to self-determination, which in turn encompasses the right of peoples to control over their sovereign territory and assets. Thus, the administration of Scottish Crown assets and resources falls squarely under the right of self-determination. Scotland, the sovereign territorial nation, meets all qualifying requirements in international law for a people whose sovereign territorial rights are being alienated by an administering power. There is no effective internal remedy. Westminster cannot lawfully adjudicate its own breach. What about the devolved administration at Holyrood, which manages much of the Scottish Crown estate? Although it is elected in Scotland, this administration is a branch of the Westminster government, created under the Scotland Act and subject to English parliamentary sovereignty. And as an extension of the continuing state of England, the administering power, it cannot act on behalf of the administered people and territory. Nor can it assume the title inherent in the Crown, the community of the realm of Scotland. Once Scotland's territorial alienation is understood as a breach of the rights involved in self-determination, then the whole of the conditions of that breach, the true relationship between England and Scotland, that of dependency and administering power, will also be understood. As with Namibia, East Timor and Chagos, the alienation of Scotland's territory and resources without consent, without title, is not a bilateral dispute, but a question of rights owed to the international community as a whole. The remedy, therefore, lies in the erga omnes obligations which follow, and by which states must not recognise the UK's claim to Scottish assets or sovereignty, nor aid administration of Scottish assets, UK administration of Scottish assets, oil concessions, free ports, fishing quotas, defence basing. States may be required to assist the Scottish people in realising self-determination, that is, supporting the reassertion of the Scottish Crown, the people, as the lawful constitutional authority. The process by which this alienation is revealed will also reveal the true legal personality of Scotland within the United Kingdom, so establishing the grounds for inscribing Scotland on the list of recognised NSGTs. And that is why we feel that it is important to obtain a referral through a friendly nation to the ICJ for that to be ruled on, investigated, because that will reveal the real guts, the mechanics of the constitutional relationship between Scotland and England, allowing the international community to identify Scotland as a non-self-governing territory. But decolonisation must surely be more than independence from an administering power. It must encompass the restoration of the rights, the property, the identities, the histories, and the traditions of colonised nations, And it must fully recognise that these are legal as well as human rights. Ending colonial rule or administration does not undo or repair the unspeakable harms of colonisation. It does not of itself restore what has been stolen or is razed, nor make reparation for these things. It's time that the world looked towards practical and restorative remedies for the harms done to colonised peoples and the violence which the erasure of peoples and nations and histories does and has done to the whole of humanity. International recognition of Scotland's territorial status and restoration of its rights is a first step towards such restorative justice, and I humbly submit that Scotland and her people have already waited too long for such a remedy. Thank you.